Have you ever come across a layer cake that you loved, so you bought it, but then the more you looked at it, the more you realized it was way too pretty and you didn't want to cut it up? So I came up with this design, but I have to warn you, this tutorial comes with maybe some unconventional methods. And so please don't send me mail about the methods I used in this. Instead, just try it out. I did come up with an alternative for people who don't like the unconventional method. So this is the tutorial. Here we go. For this project, I'm going to use one layer cake. This is a Jordan Fabrics Mattes hand cut. The name of the line is Zen, and there's 40 pieces. One of the reasons why I chose this layer cake is because it's beautiful. And you know, sometimes you get these layer cakes that are so pretty that you do not want to cut them up. So this one fits that bill. These prints are so beautiful and they almost look like kind of watercolory, and they're super pretty. And so I decided that I love this one with the kind of kaleidoscope print on it. Got hummingbirds, and just, it's so beautiful. And you know, sometimes you do get these layer cakes that are too pretty to cut up. So that's why I chose this. My accent fabric will be 2 charm packs. This is called Illustrations by Allie K Designs, and it's all in blacks and whites, and there are some grays in here too. And I just think this is going to be a lovely accent for these, and it's just super pretty. So I got 2 charm packs. There's 42 in each of these charm packs, so I will have 4 of them left over. And then this layer cake has 40 pieces. So I'm going to separate these out. Another reason I chose this layer cake is because it's 2 of every print. So I'm going to separate these prints. I'm going to use 20 layer cake, 20 10-inch squares for the body of the quilt. And then I will need 4 of these charm packs for each 10-inch square. So let me separate these out and then we will get started. So now the first thing I'm going to do is, with my charm packs, I'm going to cut them down to 4.5 inches because 5 inches is too big for this project. So I'm just going to grab a couple and use my square, and I'm going to cut them down to 4.5 inches. Instead of putting my 4.5-inch line along the corner, I like to center my 4.5 somewhere within the block so that I know that I will have a true 4.5, and also because it gets rid of those pinked edges, which I'm not a huge fan of. So I like to work without pinked edges, which is another reason I like Matt's hand cuts, because he does not pink the edges on his. They're a nice straight edge and they're so accurate. But this did not come like that. So I'm cutting these down to 4.5 inches. So I'm going to do that to all of my charm squares, and I'm going to set those aside. All right, so to make this block, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take one of your layer cake squares, your 10-inch squares, and then you will choose 4 different charm squares. And I like to vary them up between the grays and the blacks. Just make them 4 different ones. And then you're going to, you can do this one of 2 ways. You're going to snowball one of these squares to each of the corners. And some people like to draw a line on the back right down the middle like this with a light pencil or a pen, just enough so you can see it. And then you will snowball it here. I have diagonal seam tape on my machine, so that makes it easier for me. And you're just going to snowball all 4 corners like this. So let me go do that real quick. Once you snowball them, don't cut them yet. We're going to do something else to them before we cut. All right, so I've got this seam line here that I've sewn, and I'm just going to line that right up along the left side of my presser foot. And I'm going to sew another line right down there. So now I've got 2 lines sewn right on there. Now this, my presser foot, it's a lot less than 1/2 inch. I would say it's about another 1/4 inch. And so I'm okay with having smaller seam allowances. But if it feels better to have that 1/4 inch seam allowance, go ahead and measure 1/2 inch away. And then when you sew that line, you can cut in the middle, and you will have your block will look slightly different than mine, but it will still have the same effect. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my presser foot as a guide for sewing that second line. On all 4 sides. Just like that. Okay, so now I've got my 2 lines across each charm square, and now I'm just going to cut right in between those 2 lines I've sewn. And again, as I mentioned, since I've used my presser foot, which is less than 1/2 inch, my seam allowances are going to be smaller, but they're not so small that my fabric is going to pull or rip. So I'm just going to go around the circle and cut. You can use your rotary cutter if it's more comfortable. I like using my scissors just because I feel like I have a little more control over my cuts. And I'm just going to go around and cut in between those 2 stitching lines. And when I'm all done, I will end up with 4 half square triangles. And so let me get this last one cut, and then I'll show you what we are going to do next. Now these half square triangles, the next step is to just press them open. I like to press them to the charm square. So let me get those pressed real quick. And once you get those pressed, you'll also want to press back your square here, and so that will also be pressed, so you will still have a square when you're all done. So now what I've got my 10-inch square that has 4 corners that are snowballed, and now I have 4 half square triangles that are pressed. So the next step is to take your half square triangles. I'll use this one for an example. And now we're going to snowball the corners again with this, but we're going to use our half square triangles as our snowball. So when you, and I'm going to match the same pattern to the same one. So this one will go with this one, etc. And when I snowball these corners on now, I'm going to make it so that the opposite print is right sides together. So I don't want to put the same print right sides together. I want to turn it so the opposite is right sides together. And I'm just going to snowball that just like this. And again, you can either use your ruler to measure 1/2 inch away from your seam line, draw that line right on there like that, and then sew along that line. Or you can do what I'm going to do again, is to use my presser foot as the guide, the left side of my presser foot as the guide to sew that right on. So let me get all of these attached, and then we'll go to the next step. Okay, so here we go. I've sewn all of these on, and I matched up the layer cake with the charm square, opposite colors together, and I've sewn all of those on. We're not going to stop there. We're going to do the same thing we did before, and we're going to go around and we're going to sew yet another seam, either 1/2 inch away or a presser foot away, and I'm going to go around. So when we're all said and done, we will have 3 stitching lines to look at. So let me go sew it all around one more time. All right, so that is done. Now, if you notice, I've got 3 stitching lines on each corner there that you can see. So there's the original one, and then the 2 that I've just added. On each one, there's 3 stitching lines. So I'm going to cut now in between the last 2 stitching lines that I did. So let me get those cut just like that. Again, I'm using my scissors. If you are more comfortable using your rotary cutter, you can do that. But I feel better using my scissors for this. It just gives me more control in my head anyway. And just cutting in the middle, right between those 2 stitching lines. And one more. So when this is all done, you will have, again, 4 more half square triangles, but they will be smaller. So we're going to press those open. And then when you open this, you will end up with a block that kind of looks a little wonky like this, but it will have these extra lines in here. So let me press everything open, and then I'll show you what it looks like. So after doing that, here's what you will end up with. Again, you will have your 4 half square triangles that were smaller than the originals, and then you'll have a piece that looks like this. Now, when you're pressing this one, press this way and this way. So press with the grain. Try not to press diagonally because you'll end up with some puckers in the middle like this. So really try to press it as much as you can and as straight as you can. I might take this one back and press it again. So these 4 half square triangles we're going to put aside for now because we will use those later on in the quilt. So I've got a pile of these half square triangles that I've made so far. And again, like I said, we're going to use these later on in the quilt. So those are in a pile. And this one, now we're going to square it up. And it should still be really, really close to 10 inches because we haven't changed the size of this. It might be 9 3/4 inches, and that's okay. I'm going to square mine up. And to do that, we're going to use these sides, which we already know are straight. We're going to use those to square this up. So I'm just going to do it side by side. I'm going to put a line along that straight edge of the top, and I'm going to line it up with the straight edge of the side like this. And I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and trim these sides off just like that. And I'm going to give it a 1/4 turn, lining it up with a line on my cutting board, maybe whatever is comfortable for you. Again, lining up this top edge, which we know is square, and then along the side here, and I'm going to give that a cut. And just 2 more times, just keep rotating it a 1/4 turn and lining it up, and you will end up with a square block. And I'll give it one more. I think you're getting the idea. And one more cut. And there we go. So there is our block, our main block that we're going to use for this quilt. So get all of these done. Do it with half of your layer cake. And we're going to save the other half of the layer cake for our sashing. And these little guys will be our cornerstones. So get all these sewn up, and then we'll go to the next step. Now with the rest of the layer cake, remember we divided them in half, so we still have 20 left over. We are going to cut the rest of these into 2.5-inch strips. And that is both going to be for our sashing, and then hopefully we will have enough for a binding as well. So let's cut these into 2.5-inch strips. And I've got about 4, I think, or 5 of these stacked up together because I feel comfortable cutting that many at once. And so I'm just going to just cut all of them into 2.5 inch strips, again, which will be for both my sashing and my binding. Now, after I've got these cut, you'll remember the leftover half square triangles that we had. Okay, those are done. Now these leftover half square triangles that we had from our block, we're going to turn these into hourglass blocks. So you started with 80 of these that are left over, and when you pair them up and sew them together to make hourglass blocks, you will end up with 40, which you only will need 30 for your sashing if you do sashing all around the edges and in between all the blocks. So as they stand right now, they are around, I'd say they're around 3 inches, give or take. And so if I cut these into, or if I sew these into hourglass blocks, then I'm going to square them up to 2.5 inches. So all I have to do is put them together with the seams going in opposite directions so that they will nest. And then I'll just put those seams together like this, just like this, and then make sure they're all nested nice and good. And then I'm going to either draw a line down the middle of this, just like so, with a light pencil or whatever you have. And then we're going to sew right on that line. So I'm just going to chain piece these, and then I will also cut, and then after I chain piece them, I'll cut about 1/4 inch away from that line. So let me show you what that's going to look like. So as you can see, I've sewn a line just right down the middle of that after I put them together. Now I'm going to cut about 1/4 inch away, and you can use your rotary cutter for this if you want. For me, it's just as easy. And then I'll press it back. And now I've got a little hourglass block. And now I'm going to square that up to 2.5 inches. I'm just going to use my 45-degree line on there, making sure I'm within the 2.5 inches there. And I'm just going to slice it up 2 edges at a time, turn it over, and do the same thing. Now I can use my 2.5 inch line on the sides, keeping my 45-degree line right on that seam, and cut that straight across. So now I've got a little hourglass, and that is going to be my cornerstones to go along with the sashing. Excuse me, my dog just hit my camera. That'll go along with the sashing. So let's get all this put together and see how it looks. So here I've got everything sewn together. When I made the sashings and the cornerstones, I put them together in rows. So I put them up here in rows. I sewed them together all in rows, and then make sure that when you sew everything together, when you make your rows, press your seams toward the sashing. So in the little skinny rows of sashing, I pressed the seams away from the cornerstones and toward the sashing. And then when you do your bigger rows, press your seams toward the sashing. That way when you sew your rows together, all of your seams will nest just the way that they are supposed to. Make sure you get your quilty t-shirts too, by the way. This one I love. It's one of my favorite new shirts. I just got it, so make sure you get your shirts. They're actually on sale right now as we speak. There's a link in the description. This quilt here measures about 59 by 48. This quilt also hasn't quite decided if it wants additional borders or not. So I'm going to stare at it for a while and let it speak to me. And then I will decide, or I will let the quilt decide whether it gets borders or not. So I love this. I love how the colors go together. I love how it shows off the original layer cake, because it was just one of those ones that was just too pretty to cut. Very, very pretty. Make sure you join the Revelation Quilt Guild, which is on Facebook. There's also a link to that in the description. We'd love to see all of the things you make. And then you can join our monthly challenges. Right now the challenge is green and it's about to wrap up. So I'm really excited to see all of the projects. And some people have submitted some amazing projects. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again for everybody for watching, and thank you. A special thanks goes to my members. So get out those layer cakes that are too pretty to cut up, and you can show them off with this great quilt.